I don't tell jokes. I tell anecdotes and lies, but I don't tell jokes. Anyway, this is a joke. And it's not a joke, it's a story. It's a true story. It really happened.
He used to say he couldn't die. He was booked. It sounded like a punchline. One more joke from a man who had been telling them for 90 years. But George Burns actually meant it. He kept signing contracts for shows years in the future, kept promising audiences he'd see them again, kept lighting cigars he wasn't supposed to smoke, as if sheer stubbornness could out-argue biology. And for a stretch of time that shouldn't have been possible, it worked. He outlived his wife by 32 years, outlived his own career twice, and walked into the record books as the oldest person ever to have a #1 movie. But before any of that, before the cigar and the toupee and the eyebrow raised at the camera like he was letting you in on a secret, he was just a hungry kid from the Lower East Side named Nathan Birnbaum, and nobody, least of all him, thought he'd live to see 30. He was born on January 20th, 1896, in a cramped tenement apartment on Rivington Street, the 9th of 12 children squeezed into a handful of rooms that never seemed to hold enough heat. His parents, Louis and Dora Birnbaum, were Jewish immigrants who had crossed an ocean carrying almost nothing, and life in New York didn't hand them much more once they arrived. Louis worked wherever he could find it, as a cantor, a coat presser, whatever paid that week, and the family lived the way most immigrant families on that block lived, crowded, cold, and one bad month away from disaster. Then the bad month came anyway. When Nathan was 7, his father died suddenly, and childhood, such as it was, ended for him right there. There was no time to grieve in the way children are supposed to grieve. There was only the question of how a family with no income was going to eat. So he went to work. He shined shoes on street corners for pennies. He sold newspapers. He ran errands for the smokier, more desperate hustlers who worked the same blocks he did. And along the way, he picked up something more valuable than any of those wages: an education in reading a crowd. Standing on a corner, trying to talk a stranger into a nickel shoe shine is not so different, it turns out, from standing on a stage trying to talk a room into laughing. Both require you to notice, instantly, who's in a hurry, who's lonely, who wants to be flattered, and who wants to be left alone. Burns spent his whole life insisting that vaudeville hadn't taught him timing. The street had. He got his first real taste of performing almost by accident, singing on street corners with a rotating cast of neighborhood kids and acts with names that changed as often as the members did. He wasn't particularly good. He knew he wasn't particularly good. What he had instead was persistence, an almost pathological refusal to stop trying even after the act collapsed, the partners quit, and the bookings dried up. By his teens, he had performed in nearly every configuration a broke kid with a few songs and a lot of nerve could invent: duos, trios, novelty acts with names he'd later admit were embarrassing. None of it worked. He played terrible theaters for terrible money in terrible towns, and more than once he was let go mid-run because the act simply wasn't landing. It's worth sitting with that for a second, because the version of George Burns most people remember is effortless. The raised eyebrow, the perfectly timed pause, the sense that comedy just happened to him. That version took about 25 years of total commercial failure to build. Somewhere in that stretch, Nathan Birnbaum became George Burns, a stage name assembled the way a struggling performer assembles anything out of whatever was on hand. He tried on a string of identities before landing on the one that stuck, chasing bookings under different names so agents who'd already seen one failed act wouldn't recognize him under the next. It was less a branding decision than survival. If nobody wanted to hire Nathan Birnbaum's act again, then Nathan Birnbaum's act would simply cease to exist, and someone new would knock on the door instead. That someone new finally caught a break in 1923 in Chicago on a bill that was supposed to feature George doing a fairly standard song and patter act. He wasn't the reason people remember that meeting. The reason was a 25-year-old performer named Gracie Allen, whose family vaudeville act had recently fallen apart and who was looking for a new partner. George offered her a spot in his act, and by every account of what happened next, the plan was completely conventional. He would be the comedian, she would be the straight woman feeding him lines. It took exactly one performance in front of a live audience to blow that plan apart. George delivered the jokes as written, and the audience sat there politely. Gracie delivered her supposedly unfunny straight lines, and the audience roared. Somewhere in the middle of that first show, George Burns did something that most performers with an ego find almost impossible to do. He recognized, in real time, that he was the less funny half of the act, and instead of fighting it, he rebuilt the entire routine around her. That decision is arguably the single most important career move he ever made, and it's telling that it wasn't really a joke, a bit, or a clever line. It was an act of humility from a man who had spent 2 decades failing to get laughs on his own. From that point forward, George Burns played the straight man, standing slightly to the side, letting Gracie's scrambled, dizzy logic run wild while he reacted with a raised eyebrow and a perfectly timed pause. Audiences couldn't get enough of it. The act she and George built together, Burns and Allen, started climbing the vaudeville circuits, and by the mid-1920s they weren't just working, they were headlining. They married on January 7th, 1926, and from that point on, their personal and professional lives were braided so tightly together that separating them became almost pointless. They signed contracts that required them to perform only as a pair. They wrote each other into their own biographies. When Gracie began fainting during rehearsals in the late 1920s, it turned out to be an early sign of a serious heart condition that would quietly shadow her for the rest of her life, something she pushed through for decades, performing at the top of her craft while privately managing a diagnosis that would eventually force her into retirement. Burns and Allen made the leap into radio in 1932, and it's hard to overstate how completely it changed the shape of their careers. Within a few years, their show was reaching tens of millions of listeners a week, an audience size that was almost unthinkable for the era. Part of the appeal was structural. George had quietly become one of the most disciplined writers in the business, shaping nearly every script, even as the public credited Gracie with being the show's comic engine. A misconception George encouraged rather than corrected, because he genuinely believed she deserved the spotlight more than he did. Part of the appeal was simply Gracie herself, whose scrambled, non-sequitur logic became a genuine cultural phenomenon. In 1933, in one of the more surreal publicity stunts in broadcasting history, Gracie ran a mock presidential campaign as part of the show's storyline, touring the country in character and drawing real, if bewildered, public attention. It was a joke that blurred, just slightly, into something that looked like real political theater, a preview, in its own goofy way, of how entertainment and public life would keep bleeding into each other for the rest of the century. They carried that same act into television in 1950 with the George Burns and Gracie Allen Show, one of the earliest and most influential domestic sitcoms, and one of the strangest, because George would periodically step outside the scene entirely and talk directly to the audience, narrating his own sitcom from a kind of meta-distance that television comedy wouldn't fully catch up to for decades. The show ran for 8 seasons and helped define what a family sitcom could look like just as the format was being invented. Then, in 1958, Gracie's declining health finally forced her to walk away from performing for good. She had spent nearly 3 decades working through pain most of her audience never saw. She died on August 27, 1964, from a heart attack at 69 years old. George said afterward that he had cried only twice in his life, once for his mother, once for Gracie, and for years after her death, he kept an empty chair on stage during his live shows, turning to it between bits and delivering a line to her the way he always had, telling the crowd she was just off stage for a moment. It wasn't a bit built for laughs. People in the audience cried along with him. What followed was the part of his story that almost nobody expects, because by any reasonable measure, George Burns' career should have ended along with his marriage. He was in his late 60s. He had spent nearly 40 years as one half of a duo, and he had never really performed or written or existed professionally as a solo act. His first attempt at a solo sitcom, Wendy and Me, lasted a single season before it was canceled. He drank too much and smoked constantly, and in 1967, he collapsed on stage in Las Vegas from sheer exhaustion. Doctors told him plainly that he would not survive another year if he didn't change course. He quit drinking and quit the excess overnight, rebuilt his stamina, and went back to work on nightclub stages, essentially starting his career over in his 70s with no partner, no format, and no guarantee that audiences still wanted him. Then, in 1975, at 79 years old, he was cast in The Sunshine Boys opposite Walter Matthau, playing a role that had originally been intended for his old friend Jack Benny, who had died before filming began. The film was a hit, and on March 29, 1976, George Burns won the Academy Award for Best Supporting Actor at 80 years old, becoming, at the time, the oldest actor ever to win a competitive Oscar. It's genuinely one of the great third acts in American entertainment history. A man who had spent decades as the reliable half of someone else's act suddenly became a movie star in his own right, in the decade of his life when most careers, if they've survived at all, are winding down rather than beginning. He followed it 2 years later with Oh God, playing the Almighty as a wry, cigar-smoking old man in a windbreaker, and the film became one of the biggest hits of 1977. He kept working through his 80s and into his 90s at a pace that would exhaust performers a third his age. Nightclub residencies, sequels, recordings, a Grammy-winning album built around old recordings of Gracie's voice mixed with his own, as though he were finding one more way to keep performing alongside her. In 1983, at 87, he signed a 5-year contract in Las Vegas that included a promise to perform a show on his 100th birthday, a deal that was equal parts business arrangement and open dare to mortality itself. He survived triple bypass surgery at 88 and was back filming within months. At 92, he was honored at the Kennedy Center. Age finally caught up with him in the summer of 1994 when he slipped his bathtub, struck his head, and required emergency surgery to relieve pressure on his brain. He never fully recovered his strength after that fall, and he had to cancel the long-promised, long-sold-out 100th birthday show in Las Vegas that he'd been publicly working toward for over a decade. But he made it to the birthday itself. On January 20th, 1996, George Burns turned 100 years old, holding a small, quiet celebration at home because he was too frail for the grand public one he'd once planned. Less than 2 months later, on March 9th, 1996, he died at home in Beverly Hills. His estate was valued at somewhere north of $30 million, built not just from decades of performing, but from real estate investments he'd quietly made going back to the Depression era, when he used vaudeville earnings to buy up-distressed properties while much of the country panicked. Personal items from his life, scripts, photographs, memorabilia, cigars, were later auctioned off, drawing collectors eager to own a small piece of him. And here is where the popular, sensationalized version of his story usually gets it wrong. The narrative that circulates online, the one claiming he wrote his own children out of his will entirely and left every last dollar to strangers as some final act of secret betrayal, does not hold up against the actual record. His 2 children, Ronnie and Sandra, whom he and Gracie had adopted in the 1930s, remained part of his life until the end. Ronnie, in particular, stayed close enough to his father that biographers researching Burns's later years drew directly on cooperation from both children. The idea of a hidden scandal severing that relationship simply isn't supported by the historical record. It's the kind of clean, shocking twist that spreads easily online precisely because it's simpler and more dramatic than the Messier truth. The Messier truth is this. George Burns spent the last third of his life as a man in dialogue with his own mortality, refusing, with almost comic stubbornness, to let it dictate his schedule. He built a fortune out of childhood that had nothing. He found the greatest creative partnership of his life, not by being the funniest person in the room, but by recognizing at 27 that someone else was funnier and building his whole career around getting out of her way. He lost her and kept performing to an empty chair rather than stop talking to her altogether. And when the industry assumed his story was over, he started an entirely new one at an age when most people have stopped expecting anything new from their lives at all. That's the real ending, not a scandal, not a betrayal, not a mystery beneficiary nobody saw coming. Just a kid from Rivington Street who shined shoes for pennies, failed on stage for 25 years, married the one person who could out-funny him, buried her, and then, somehow, kept going for another 3 decades, cigar in hand. Still working, still writing, still absolutely certain that the show wasn't over yet.